Welcome again, everybody, to Grow Yourself from the Inside Out. My special guest is Douglas Noll, goes by Doug. And I'll tell you, this is amongst the really most interesting podcasts that I've had to date. And I want to tell you just a little bit about him before we start talking to Doug. First of all, Doug is a had a very, left a very successful career as a trial lawyer to become a peacemaker. His calling is to serve humanity, and he executes his calling at many levels and in many ways. He's an award-winning author, teacher, and trainer. We'll talk about the authorship. He's also a highly experienced mediator. Doug's work carries him from international work to helping people resolve deep interpersonal and ideological conflicts. But I'm just getting started here. So Doug has written 4 books. His fourth, most recent, is De-escalate: How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. Another book that he authored was called Elusive Peace: How Modern Diplomatic Strategies Could Better Resolve World Conflicts. Again, we'll ask him about all of these. He's honored as an Encore Fellow in 2014 by encore.org for the Prison of Peace Project. He was honored by California Lawyer magazine as California Attorney of the Year in 2012. Doug has been voted one of the best lawyers in America. Doug is an adjunct professor of law at San Joaquin College of Law, but he's also an adjunct to many different colleges, including the very esteemed Pepperdine School of Strauss of Law at the Strauss Institute. Doug is also, hang on, he's a second-degree black belt in Chinese Kung Fu, and he's taught Tai Chi for over 10 years. Oh, but there's more. And, he's a certified level 3 ski instructor. He's an instrument-rated pilot with multi-engine and helicopter ratings. He's a jazz violinist, and he's a whitewater rafter. And I know I don't have on this list, but he's also a Boy Scout. Give me a second. I just lost my thought there. But Doug, welcome to Grow Yourself from the Inside Out. It's such a privilege and pleasure to have you here. Honestly, I just can't wait to start talking.
Well, thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise. So help me get my little brain back intact. You were a Boy Scout, but an Eagle Scout. That's what I was trying to say. Which, listen, I've sponsored an Eagle Scout. I know what that takes, and that's very, very interesting. So listen, there are so many things to talk about, but Doug, just tell us a little about who Doug Noll is. Where are you coming from today to our audience, and just tell us a little bit about your life and your background.
So I was born in 1950. I'm 71 years old. I know I don't look it.
No, you don't.
My biological age is more like about 60, based on my DNA, but that's because of a lot of things that I do, my wife and I do, to take care of ourselves. So I was born in 1950, but I unfortunately was born with a lot of disabilities. I was nearly partially blind, partially deaf, 2 club feet. I had 3 surgeries before I was 3 years old. Couldn't even walk until I was 3. And a lot of other problems. But I was born with a good intellect. The challenge I had in my life was back in those days. I was the oldest of 4 boys, and my parents had no idea how to deal with a super smart kid who's suffered from a lot of physical disabilities. Because even today, being athletic and being part of the cool kids was pretty important in those days. And because I was so screwed up, there was no way I could compete. I couldn't do little league. I couldn't play football. I ended up becoming a swimmer and competed from about 12 years old till I graduated from high school at 18 as a competitive swimmer. And that was good because it was all upper body. I didn't have to worry about my legs so much. So they were post-Victorians. And in those days, there was a guy, a pediatrician, Dr. Spock, Benjamin Spock, who had this whole thing about don't coddle your children. And so they didn't coddle me.
Very interesting.
And there was an upside and a downside to that. The upside was that I had to push through a lot of pain, physical pain and emotional pain, and really learn how to get around all of the obstacles that were put in front of me. And that taught me persistence and patience and discipline. And the downside was that I was emotionally, I did not develop well emotionally, and I covered it up with arrogance and kind of full of myself. And but inside I was kind of an emotional mess. So, but I faked it really well because I was smart. I was graduated from high school, did well, and attended Dartmouth College, Ivy League.
Yes. Yeah.
I spent 4 years in New Hampshire, came back to California, and took a year off to teach skiing, and then entered law school in 1974, and did very, very well in law school. I was on the law review, dean's list, all that stuff, which opened up opportunities for me to work for judges, and I accepted a position with an appellate judge in Central California, in Fresno, because I love the mountains and I wanted to live near the mountains, which is why I did not want to live in LA or San Francisco. So I clerked for a year and then entered private practice as a young associate in a bankruptcy litigation firm in September of 1978. And they wanted me to become a big-time commercial and business trial lawyer, and that's what happened. And I tried my first jury trial 6 weeks after I joined the firm in November of 1978. And my second trial was the defense of a $36 million securities fraud case in federal court in San Diego, starting in December of 1978. And that's how my career started. And so for the next 22 years, I was handled large, complex cases, tried over 250 cases, arbitrations, hearings, all kinds of stuff. Won big, lost big, which is the nature of the work.
One big yes. Wow.
And so that's kind of how my career got started.
Yes, and I'm already seeing a trend in your personality or your way of approaching life. But let me ask, so where are you coming? Tell us, I know where you're at, but I want the folks to know where you're at because it's a fascinating area.
I live in rural California, almost the center of the state. I'm about 60 to 70 miles south of Yosemite National Park and about 60 miles west of Kings Canyon Sequoia National Parks. I've got 10 acres here in the central Sierra Nevada with my wife. We are blessed with strong water, really strong well, and fiber optic right to our door. So I've got some of the fastest internet in California.
Goodness gracious. I
My
mean,
commute is a mile and a half down a dirt road.
is that right? I mean, listen,
Yeah,
I love that.
I don't have my commute's really 15 feet out of my house into my office. But for us to go into town, say we go into Clovis or Fresno, it's a mile and a half down a dirt road, then it's another mile on a 1-lane road, and then it's 30 miles on a 2-lane mountain highway. And finally we get to a freeway.
Wow. I mean, honestly, that's extraordinary because there are time to time. I live in Murfreesboro, which is just south of Nashville, but it's growing up. It's very busy, traffic everywhere. And when I travel, if I travel by car, and especially if I happen to go into some rural area, I literally pull over, stop, turn off the car, get out and say, okay, so this is what peace and quiet sounds like.
Exactly. And that's the environment I live in. I mean,
Yeah.
my mother still lives in Southern California. I have my 2 brothers down there, and I was down there 2 weeks ago. And, every time I drive down there, it's about a 4-hour drive, and I just shake my head and say, why do people live like that?
Yeah.
I don't get it.
That's a whole different topic because I think I mentioned to you I retired my career from the Air Force out there at Travis Air Force Base,
Right.
which is
Up north.
near Vacaville, and we had many friends, civilian friends that worked in the Bay Area, and they would tell us about their community. I couldn't comprehend it, I really couldn't,
I
and
can't
so
either.
yeah. So listen, before we get started on our topic, because there's so many things I do want to talk to you about, there's a couple of things that I picked up on just in our conversation. Is it fair to, or just in your opening remarks here, is it fair to ask or say that you are a driven human being?
I would say I used to be driven, but today I'm passionate. And I think there's a big difference between being driven and being passionate. And the difference is, at least in my experience, is that when I was driven, I was trying to fill a hole, emotional hole I had inside of myself. And so I was striving and driving and competing and searching for some kind of inner fulfillment. And when you're driven, if you don't have that hole filled, you can achieve a lot, but never fill the hole. And that creates a lot of problems. Finally, I grew up. I matured at about 50. I'm 71 today. And then the drive turned to passion. And the difference between being driven and being passionate, when you're passionate, you are already being satisfied. You're satisfied and fulfilled by whatever it is you're
Oh,
passionate about. And so you come to your life, you come to everyday life full of joy and energy to be able to serve others. To serve others. That's what I do. And so it's no longer a drive. I've achieved so much. I don't want any more awards. I don't want any more recognition. I've got two walls full of box tops. I don't need any more. What I really want to do is serve people and help people. Because I've learned so much, and I have ways of helping people. For example, stop fights and arguments in their lives forever. And I'm just super motivated to teach as many people as I can that skill, because it will change their life forever, as it has for tens of thousands of people that I've taught.
and this is fascinating because I think about people that are raising kids, and and I raised three kids, and you know, as parents, of course, we want our kids to be successful, whatever that means. I mean, we can redefine that, but and then there's other people who, as a coach, I run into executives all the time that, I congratulate them for being so successful. And typically the first words out of their mouth is that, yeah, it was at the cost of my family and my
Right.
relationships. And I was just driven to succeed, 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 win, win, win. And I don't feel fulfilled. I mean, so to hear you say that is fascinating. So what would you say, just as a little bit of added a bonus lesson here, what would you say to people raising their kids, or let's say young professionals, relative to this concept of being driven versus passionate?
So there's a great book by Richard Rohr called Up Falling, Up
Up
Falling.
Paul, yeah, I've read it. It's fascinating.
Okay, and he makes a really interesting. He has a really interesting insight about life. He says for the
Falling
first,
upward. Yeah,
yeah, falling upward.
yeah.
The first part of our life, we are out there trying to accumulate stuff and achieve. And the last part of our, and so we're pulling stuff in. And the second half of our life, we're pushing stuff out. We should be giving and giving away. And I think that's a really
Yes,
good way of looking at life.
yes.
So just by the nature of who we are as human beings and the nature of our society, from the time we're born until we're at least in our mid 40s, there's going to be a lot of striving for success, financial success, professional or business success, whatever there is. You've got to raise children, build a home, start building financial stability. I would say that, and if that becomes all consuming, then to the point of your client, it becomes you're trying to fill a hole that will never be filled by success. And so what I recommend to young people is find something that you can do that either aligns with your work, your professional work or not, that you have a deep passion for, that really fills your soul. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be a Mother Teresa thing,
Right.
uh, or even a Prison of Peace thing, which has
Hmm.
turned out to be huge. But just something that you can do that makes you feel really good about yourself. And if you only spend 4 or 5 hours a week on something like that, you can always carve out time to do that. And and then as you get older, you can start migrating from serving yourself and driving to putting more energy into what's passionate. And it might be, your passion might be something that you're doing for yourself. Like there are a lot of people. I don't play golf. But there are a lot of people who are very passionate about golf. And I would say that if you choose something that you really want to be passionate about, don't be afraid to invest time and money to develop mastery. Try to master one thing and get really good at it before you take on something else. And that's how I've got all these accomplishments, but I did it by doing just one thing at a time and really focusing on it and putting my heart and soul into figuring out how to be good at it. And, it's amazing how if you just stay focused on one thing over a period of 3 or 4 or 5 years, over a lifetime, you can accomplish amazing stuff and
You
have
know,
some amazing experiences.
I gotta say, and we talked about this earlier, but I want to bring it up because I thought it was so profound when you mentioned this. Because I asked you one about discipline, that doesn't it take discipline to be disciplined? That
How do you
and
cultivate it? Yeah, how
yeah,
do you
how do you
cultivate it?
cultivate it? Yes, but I also want to ask about that, but also about what you said about patience, that the patience that you developed I thought that was so fascinating, so real. They hadn't really thought about it in the context that you put it.
Right. Well, my problem, of course, was that I had all these disabilities,
Mhm.
and I learned slowly, and I was not
Mm.
a strong athlete. I mean, I ultimately became a swimmer, which I was very good. Well, I was okay at. I wouldn't say I was very good at it. I was okay. Uh, but because of my legs, I would have never been an elite swimmer. But at the high school level and junior high school level, I was good enough.
Yeah.
The but I was not a cool kid, and every time I had to learn something, it was slow going. I had to work really hard at it. So I learned over a lot of failures, a lot of failures, how to be patient with myself and be patient with the process. And and finally recognize that all these other kids can, you show them something, they get it, they can do it, they're experts at it. For me, it'll take 4 or 5 months for me to do something that would take another kid a couple of days to figure out. And I just realized that this is just who I am and what I've been dealt with, and this is just how it has to be. And so that's where I learned the patience. And the persistence and discipline was I had a stubborn streak in me, and somebody says you can't do that, you'll never be able to do that. I'll say, oh yeah, watch this.
Wow.
And so that's how I learned how to do
Yeah.
that. The thing about discipline is you can learn discipline if you can be disciplined to get small wins, small rewards every
Mm.
day, every day. So for example, when I'm working with people, I'll say, okay, where do you want to be in a year from now? What's your goal? Let's get very clear about that. Now we're going to back up and say, what's the one thing you can do? You got to do one thing every day that moves you an inch closer to that goal. Just one thing. And take great satisfaction in the fact that you accomplished one thing that moved you closer to the goal.
Wow.
And every
Yeah.
day, if you do that for 365 days, guess what? You're going to
Yeah.
achieve that, depending on the goal, of course. But more likely than not, you're going to be much closer to your goal, or you're going to achieve it than otherwise. And learn how to take small tasks, complete them, reward, and get the satisfaction of having completed the task well done. And that's how you build the discipline and overcome procrastination. Procrastination is nothing more than boredom, and your brain is looking for stimulation, and that's because you're not rewarding yourself.
Oh, very interesting. I've never heard that before. I mean, it makes sense. I've heard some iteration of that, but that's really interesting. So that's very interesting what you're saying, because I know in watching young people and sometimes working with young professionals, actually often working with young professionals, there is this issue of delayed gratification
That's
that
right.
I wouldn't suggest that it's like the millennials that are doing it or young people. Maybe it's always been this way for young people, but part of what I hear you saying is that the discipline, uh, hence the patience as well, that you have to be able to delay that ultimate gratification. But if you can put in small wins, that gets you, but you still have to have the patience to not want to. That's what maybe stops people from taking small steps, is that
That's
they
right.
want to launch to the end.
That's right. And everybody, we live in a microwave society. Everybody wants they want
Mhm.
instant success now. And
Yes.
for adult learners, the real problem is that when you're a beginner, you're crummy. You're incompetent. And that hurts a lot of people's self-esteem. They think they're competent. For example, in
That's
music,
right.
I'm a self-taught folk fiddler, but now I study jazz violin for the last 12 or 15 years. And I've come across so many classical players who are brilliant musicians, far better than I am, scared to death to pick up jazz and improvisation because they have to become beginners again. They have to completely restructure the way they think
Very
about music.
interesting.
And they the shame of being a beginner, because we shame beginners, is too much for them to handle, and so they shy away from it. And this is true in a lot of different things. So one of the things that I've learned is always be a beginner at something. Be humble. Always be a beginner at something.
Man, listen, okay, let's just wrap it up right here. We've got enough knowledge and wisdom to help us. I mean, just really fascinating that you talk about this. I also remember, as we talked before, you talked about that your folks didn't coddle you.
No.
I had a friend that I played tennis with, God rest his soul, Rick Blackburn. He was a very successful music executive, former, president of, I think, Capitol Records, and we played
Wow.
tennis together. And he was born with spina bifida.
Mm.
And if you watched him on the courts, his knees were bent. He could barely walk and run, but he talked about the same thing. I asked him about his success, and he said, man, my folks just let me lay there as a baby until I wanted to crawl over and grab that toy. You see, I
Right.
mean, I don't, I didn't get a sense that his parents didn't care about him. I don't think that at all. They understood what perhaps your parents, and in part what you're suggesting, and that is coddling does you no good, but for the most part, right?
Well, I would say there has to be a balance,
Okay,
and I guess it comes down to how we define coddling.
that's true. I was just thinking about that.
Um,
Yes.
you know, I think that parents today have to be emotional coaches and train their children how to be emotionally competent. But they can't do that because they're not emotionally competent themselves.
Right.
But teaching children how to be emotionally competent is not coddling them. It's teaching them how to be strong, resilient people.
100% agree.
And that you have to know how to do that. And you have to coach people to do that. And a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old has to be coached on how to manage his or her strong emotions. And most parents don't know how to do that. And so they do the opposite. They invalidate the children's emotions, which is extremely abusive. I mean,
Yes, yes.
there's a ton of science out there that shows that when you emotionally invalidate a kid, you're destroying their brain. And yet every parent does it. And what
Yeah,
do I
yeah.
mean by emotional validation? Like you're 2 years old and you fall over and you scrape your knee and start crying. And what are you told? Stop
No, no,
crying.
no.
Be a
Stop
big
crying.
boy.
Get
Don't
up.
be a
Yeah.
girly girl. Get
Yeah,
up.
yeah, yeah,
Rub dirt in it.
yeah.
Suck it up, buttercup. That's all emotionally invalidating.
Interesting. I'm going to ask you about emotional invalidating because I know it's a central principle that you talk about. But yeah, no, that's really, really terrific. And I'll tell you the other thing that I had heard you say when we talked before was, I think you said something about your life. I think it was as being a lawyer, you kind of went into this, just inertia moved you forward.
Right.
Is that
Exactly.
correct?
Yeah.
Say that again very quickly because I want to ask you about that.
Yeah.
It's something that
So,
I see a lot of.
so here I'm at Dartmouth. I'm an English lit major, and in those days, what do you do with an English lit major? I wasn't going to go into academia. I, although I was interested in science, I didn't want to work as hard as all my pre-med friends. So, you know, in those days,
Fascinating coming from
you
you,
didn't go
but
to
okay.
medical school, you went to law school, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, it was just sort of, okay, well, law school is the next obvious step to develop my intellect. I didn't really have a burning desire to be a lawyer. Didn't watch Perry Mason or any of that stuff and really think, oh, that's what I want to be, is be a courtroom lawyer. I just wanted to go to law school because I wanted to learn how to think better, and that's exactly what happened. Law school is great, rigorous training for your mind if you want to learn how to think. I would never recommend anybody going into the practice of law, but going to law school is a really good thing. A law degree is far more valuable than an MBA, and much tougher. But then, of course, you graduate from law school. What am I going to do? Well, okay, I did pretty well. Maybe I'll get a judicial clerkship, and that'll give me another year to think about what I want to do. And so it's just sort of stumbling into. I didn't have any big career plan.
Yeah.
And then you get into the practice of law, and now my competitive juices get stirred up because trial work is extremely competitive, and you just start working at it. And I'm not really thinking day to day, what does this all mean?
Right.
Until you get to the point, until things start to change, and then you do start thinking about it.
Yes. And
So
that's sort of the part that I latched on to, this idea of inertia, because I mean, inertia is what it is. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but maybe to your point, I have this thing that I talk about in my book, that shape your future, or the future will shape you.
that's right.
And that's the point that I try to bring out there, is that it's not that inertia is bad. I mean, it can be a good thing, but if you get caught in that scenario, then it's hard to get out of it.
That's right. It's exactly right. And you can get into a career where you're making a lot of money and you're seeing a lot of external success, but inside you're empty and hollow
Right. Man, I
because you've
love this.
allowed the inertia of your career trajectory, societal expectations, cultural expectations to push you along this path where you think this is what's going to make you happy, because everybody tells you if you follow this path and become a CEO, or become a highly acclaimed lawyer or physician, that everybody's going to admire you and life is going to be happy and good. And that's not the truth at all. Outward success does not mean inward happiness. I don't know any billionaires or centimillionaires that are happy people. I've met a few, and they are miserable, miserable people, miserable.
I mean, this is fascinating that you say that. And this then is one important thing because as I perhaps you do, I speak to young people all the time, particularly young professionals. And this is one of the reasons why it is so important to think at the beginning of your career what it is you want to do and where you're going. I mean, you may not get it completely clear. Like when my daughters went to college, they didn't completely know what they were going to do. And I told them, okay, so if you don't know, if you're not going specifically to be this or that, use it as a discovery period, but don't just sort of, latch into it and just keep going. And then for young people, whereas they get caught up in this career and they didn't really think about it, they haven't somewhat resolved a path. And then, as you say, inertia takes over. And by the way, there's another really practical component where where life takes over, and that is you now have bills and you have commitments,
Babies,
and boom,
house.
and that's right. And it's a little bit, I wouldn't say too late to change, but it will take a whole another thing to change that trajectory, if you will. Do you agree with what I'm saying there?
Absolutely. And the metaphor that I use with my clients is to say, think about a sailboat. If you have a sailboat without a compass, you are basically at the mercy of the winds. You'll blow wherever the winds blow you. But if you have a compass and you know how to, and you've got a goal, you're gonna go on a heading to reach a point across the body of water. It doesn't matter which way the wind is blowing. You can always set your sail to continue to move in the direction of your goal, even if the wind is coming right down on top of you from the bow. That just means you got to tack back and forth across the wind a little bit, and the journey will be a little longer. But it doesn't matter where the wind is blowing from, because you can as long as you've got a compass and you can stay on heading, you'll always get to where you want to get. So the metaphor is basically always have a goal. Even if the goal is a 1-year goal or a 2-year goal or a 3-year goal, you can always change your heading. You can always change your goal. What I see is young people are afraid of setting goals because they think they're going to get locked into concrete. And what I tell them is no, set a goal. Supposing you're 23 or 24 years old and you say, I want to be financially secure in 5 years. Well, that's a tough goal. But then you think about it. What are all the things first of all, what do you mean by financial security? And second, now once you got the definition, then what are all the things you have to have happen between now and then to make that goal occur? Now you've got a goal. Now you might start on a goal for 3 years and say, I've just decided, no, money's not that important. Great, now you change your goal. Something else is more important. That's okay. And you got to, obviously, I say, set a goal, at least an annual goal. Better to set a 5-year goal and work back. But you don't want to be changing your goal every month or two. That's no good. But you want to set a goal that's out there, ways that you can give yourself some time to move towards it.
And as a coach, and you as a coach, and professional or even a life coach, we run into people, and I guess I'm speaking for you, but I guess I know this to be true, that you run into people who maybe are mid-career or something like this, midlife, whatever it is, and they either say or imply they want to course correct. And then when you ask them where they're going, they say, I really don't know. I say, well, you're not really course correcting, are you? You see, because to your point, if you have a compass, if you know where you're going and you're on this sailboat, no matter what the wind does, even if it does blow you off course, you know that a course correction needs to be made. You know where to correct back. In fact, they say, another metaphor is the airplane. They say that, I don't know if this is true, but that 95% of the time an airplane heading to a specific destination is off course, 95% of the time. I don't know if that's true, but not technically, but the point is that the computer, if you will, is constantly course correcting.
Yes. I mean, if you watch, where I live, there's a big intersection, a major intersection in California in the airspace, because it's on the west side of the Sierra Nevada, and they have to be at a certain altitude. It's fascinating to watch the planes, how far off that point they are. They're miles off.
Oh,
but the air traffic control system is set up because it was designed that way. You can be 10 you're really not off course until you're 10 miles outside of either side of the center line of where you're supposed to be. So there's a lot of latitude, and you don't have to be You don't have to be precisely on course. You just have to know where you are so that you, and you're right, that when, especially on windy days, when you're flying and you got your GPS and autopilot hooked up, the airplane's doing all kinds of stuff. And you know, you're constantly correcting, or altitude. And that's another one. If you got an altitude hold,
Yes.
the,
Yeah.
you know, you've got your airplane's constantly changing pitch to hold altitude. But the key is you've got to, I want to stay at 8,000 feet. All right. So fine, I'll go up to 7,200 down to, or up to 8,200 down to 7,800. I mean,
Yes.
but it'll average out to 8,000 feet across the flight plan.
But the point is, for those who are listening to this and who this may resonate with, is that if you don't know where you're going, you can't course correct. You
That's
can't,
right.
you know.
Well, I think I want to really emphasize that point. You talk to mid-level, mid-career people and say, I need to do a course correction.
Mm-hmm.
And what you just said, I think, is really insightful. And that is that, okay, you want to do a course correction, but what's your initial heading? What's your initial goal?
Where are you going?
Where are you going?
I'm going west. Okay.
I mean, and you're right. We have a friend who has an interesting career as being an executive assistant for billionaires. And she was here. She lives in New York, and she was here visiting us for 5 days. And I said, Vanessa, what's your goal in life? You're 43 years old. What are you going to do? Totally clueless.
Wow.
Makes a lot of money. Works for a lot of interesting people. Works hard. Doesn't. But if I said, where do you want to be? No clue. I said, well, that's your first step. Think about what do you want? Lifestyle. You know, what do you want? What's important to you?
Wow. You know, I mean, honestly, we didn't get together to talk about this. I love it, but we both agreed, and as I always agree with particularly people like you, you know, I'm just going to follow wherever you go, because you just have so much wisdom that you know needs to come out, and people need to hear at all levels. You know, at 63, I can tell you that in this very short conversation and the previous short conversation we had, you know, this meant a lot to me in terms of my learning and things that I'm thinking about in my own life and my own career. So this is brilliant. So let's kind of move on to what we're really here to talk about. I guess you could say part of this is your book, but let me ask. So I was going to ask you, how'd you turn lawyer to peacemaker? I guess I still want to talk a little bit about that. How did you?
Let me give you the quick story.
Yeah, please do.
It was about a 12-year process.
Okay.
So, as you've said, I am a secondary black belt in a Northern Chinese animal style martial art. I took that up in 1986, and the reason that I took up the martial arts was because, one, I thought it would make me a better ski instructor, which it did. Cross training before people even knew what cross training was. And two, I wanted to get the discipline. I wanted another discipline outside of the law, to physical, mental, spiritual, physical discipline, which I thought the martial arts would help me with, and it did. Well, I ultimately got my secondary black belt about 5 years later, and the martial arts training was just like everything else. I was horrible at it for a long, long, long time, and my instructors couldn't understand why I stuck with it. And then all of a sudden one day it clicked, and you know, I got my black belt almost right away, and then I got my secondary almost right away, because I all of a sudden figured it out. But my teacher fired me after the second degree. He said, "You're too arrogant. You're too full of yourself. You're a successful lawyer, secondary black belt. You know, I mean,
Get away from
I can't teach you anymore. I can't, in good faith, teach you anymore until you go out and master Tai Chi." So I was a good student, and I said, "Yeah, I'll go out and master Tai Chi." Well, Tai Chi has two really interesting paradoxes. The first is, the softer you are, the stronger you are. Soft to be strong. And the second is, the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. Vulnerable to be powerful. Well, in the beginning, these paradoxes did not compute, but ultimately, I understood them. And so one day, a few years later, I'm in a courtroom cross-examining somebody, and I said, well, what the heck am I doing in here? So after that trial, I had a vacation planned, a river trip planned up on the main Salmon, the river of no return in central Idaho, with a bunch of friends. And I spent the week in my raft all by myself, rowing through these big rapids, thinking about how many people I'd really served as a trial lawyer. And at that point, I'd only served 5 people that really came out of the system better off than going in after hundreds of cases. And I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I don't want to go another 30 years and only serve 3 or 4 people, or 20 people, or 30 people. But I said, I don't know what I want to do. So I came back from vacation. I was driving down out of the mountains to my office, and I heard the one and only public service announcement for a new master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies being
Oh,
offered at
wow.
Fresno Pacific University, which is the West Coast Mennonite University.
Interesting.
And I ended up enrolling. And so
Mm.
from the mid 90s,
Roy,
97, I was 47 years old,
don't they have the
97,
big garlic festival out there in Roy?
that's in Gilroy.
Oh, Gilroy. Sorry. Okay.
The This is in Fresno and
Okay.
Fresno. So I
Okay.
ended up being a full-time master's degree student, a three-quarters time law professor, and a full-time trial lawyer for about 3 years, 4 years. It was really intense, and that kind of was with the beginning and the end of my first marriage. But these people really, it was an amazing experience. Unfortunately, the degree program is dwindling away there, but in those days, it was amazing. One of the most amazing intellectual experiences of my life. And all of a sudden, I began to see what was missing from the practice of law. I began to understand why people hate lawyers so much. And I started thinking about, all right, how can I be a problem solver rather than a problem creator?
Mm.
And, or how can I help people prevent the kinds of conflicts and disputes that I get into, that I am called into to help solve through a judicial process? And I had a lot of conversations with my partners over those years, and they were really, half of them thought it was great. The other half were really pissed off at me. I was the second
Yeah.
highest earner in the law firm. I wanted to
Oh,
stop all that. And finally, one day, the managing partner, who was a peer of mine, he and I graduated from law school the same year. He came in one day with no authority, and he said, "You're not getting any more paychecks until you stop this peacemaking shit." And that was on a Friday in mid-October 2000. And I thought about it over the weekend and crunched some numbers. And I came back on Monday and said, I quit. Handed him all my stuff,
oh,
and I'll be gone on Friday. And I literally walked away from a
wow.
22-year trial career, left $10 million in the firm, earnings more than I'd taken out, and I just walked out and started my own peacemaking practice on November 1st, 2000. Best decision I'd ever made.
That
Best
is
decision I ever made.
unbelievable. I mean, you're talking about, I don't know if you showed up on that Monday morning with a royal flush or you just folded, but however it was, you seem to have won, if you want to say it that way.
Well, it turned out, and in retrospect, it was a brilliant decision, even though I did everything I told my clients never to do. I didn't have a business plan. I didn't have any long-term goals. I didn't have a lot of working capital. I just said, I'm done here. And I just said, the universe is going to take care of me, and we'll just see what happens. And I had enough money to be able
Yeah.
to keep going. And slowly I started building a professional mediation practice. And about a year or two later, I got it. I was selected as a mediator in a huge dispute between real estate developers involving a $500 million real estate partnership that they had to mediate the dissolution of it. And it was very complex business and tax problems. And so it called in, and we successfully got it settled. And that's how I made my chops in the region. Everybody knew that, okay, he was a great trial lawyer, and obviously he can help people solve big problems. And then I've been called into all kinds of different kinds of conflicts all over the place. So that's how it started.
Wow, man, that's fascinating. I can't help but to ask before we continue move on there, but about self-awareness, that as I'm listening to you talk about these ideas, these changes that you're making, and most particularly this one, I'm not even sure I know what the question is, but it does take a fair amount of self-awareness to be able to sort of stop in your life, step back and look at your situation and go, because back to the whole inertia thing and all these other sorts of things, you sort of get on this course and you just keep going. And yeah, it might take a while, but I guess I just want to ask you about that sort of open-endedly, how, you know, the importance of self-awareness as a professional, as a human being, or whatever the case might be.
Well, I think emotional self-awareness is critical. I didn't have it at the time.
Yeah.
You know,
But you were able
it's
to
something
stop and think about this and go back on Monday and say, okay, I quit. I mean, you can't
well,
do that
okay.
without self-awareness.
Well, you can if you're pissed off enough.
Oh, okay. Well, that's okay. Okay.
All right.
Fair enough.
I was fed up. I was fed up with
Okay.
it. They had been ripping me off for years. We'd been supporting partners in the firm who had never carried their own weight. I had won some huge lawsuits, and this particular partner, who was the managing partner at the time, made sure that he feathered his own nest
I see.
at the expense of me.
Yeah.
And I was a trusting soul, thinking that all right, I'll bring in the bacon and it'll get divided up fairly and my
Yeah,
efforts
yeah,
will be recognized.
yeah,
And they never were.
yeah.
And
Wow.
I finally, when he came in, that was, they had pushed me out of a partner office into a paralegal cubicle. My secretary retired and they didn't replace my secretary. I didn't get a
Yeah,
new secretary. I mean,
yeah,
they were pulling bully stuff on me to try to get me
yeah.
to change. And I was very tolerant. I learned all this peacemaking stuff. So I,
Hmm.
didn't get mad, didn't get angry. And finally, when he came in that day and said, no more, no, where he had absolutely no authority to do that. But I just said, all right, that's it. I'm done with this.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't need this crap anymore.
I see.
And I
Okay.
just
That.
figured out how to deal with it. Now, once I got out of that, it was a very toxic environment. And once I got out, that's when my growth really started.
Okay.
It didn't, it didn't happen overnight. It took years and years and years of work. Uh, but that's when I really started the slow process of becoming emotionally competent, becoming authentic, becoming honest with
Yeah.
myself.
Yes.
And it was not an easy journey.
Yes. Hence, again, I mean, my book came out in 2012, so I'm not trying to hear promoted, but I'm trying to bring out this point that you're suggesting there. And one of the principles in my book is that, change and transition is a place for tremendous growth.
That's right.
And one of the reasons is because of the self-awareness piece. That if you're capable, that emotional difficulty makes you stop and go, wow, what's happening here? And now you have to traverse that gap from the old world, from where you were to where you need to
So
be. And that whole process causes you, if you will allow it, to think deeper about what's happening.
that's right. And I would say that it's not so much self-awareness as it is
Mhm.
courage.
I might agree with that.
You
Absolutely.
know,
Yeah.
we were talking earlier about inertia and how you get stuck
Hmm.
on a career trajectory and
Hmm.
you're making a lot of money, you're in a gilded cage and you
Hmm.
live in the big house with the big car and the country club and all this stuff and you're, got high level
Yeah.
C level position and
Yeah.
everybody looks at you and it's all about status.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and yet you find it completely unfulfilling.
Yeah.
Do you have the courage to walk
That's
away?
right. So let me conclude this little piece by sharing with our audience something that I think we would both agree on is that what you just talked about, that whole status and money and thing. I mean, it's not that it's completely a bad thing, but that doesn't mean shit in life. And people need to understand that when you
Right.
get later on, you realize that, boy, was I, did I have my ladder on the wrong wall trying to climb the ladder of success?
Well, as I would say it, boy,
Hmm.
did I let society suck me into a
Yeah.
mindset that is
Yes.
absolutely worthless.
Yes, 100%. So you just mentioned just now, and this is really what in part what we're talking about is you mentioned emotional, and you've said it a few times, emotional competence. So
Right.
most of us are aware of emotional intelligence.
Uh-huh.
Is there a difference? Is there a distinction
Yes,
between the two? Okay.
huge.
Okay.
Emotional intelligence was a term coined by John Mayer and Peter Salovey,
Mm.
who were psychologists, one at the
Yes.
University of New Hampshire, the other one at Yale. And they were studying different kinds of social intelligence, and because they wanted to see what other kinds of intelligence were out there other than different forms of cognitive intelligence, such as the Stanford Binet IQ test. And they started thinking about it, and they wrote some early papers in the 1990s, early 1990s, and started talking about this concept of emotional intelligence and developed an assessment to see whether or not people were emotionally intelligent. Can we measure this?
Hmm.
Well, Daniel Goleman picked up on
Yes.
that, and he has a PhD, but he was at that time not practicing as a psychologist. He was a New York Times science writer. He picked up on their work and wrote his best-selling book, but completely distorted everything they were saying, made wild claims with no scientific support. And to this
Interesting.
day, he makes wild claims with no scientific support.
Yes, that's interesting you say that because I'm aware that he sort of mostly coined this idea later, but I've recently been reading this that.
Right. And so if you go, and I have read the literature, I mean, I go out and study the academic literature, emotional intelligence. The academics look at Daniel Goleman and this whole commercial field of emotional intelligence in appalled that
Wow.
they are making all of these claims because
Wow.
the truth of the matter is you cannot learn emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
It's a
Interesting.
test. It's like saying you can learn IQ. But what you can learn is emotional competency.
Got it.
And so that's why I tell people you can go online, and I've done this, and I did a Google search for companies that are offering emotional intelligence training. There are over 240 of them. And the first thing I ask myself is, what are the qualifications of the instructors, and how do I know that they're emotionally competent? Because you can't teach what you can't do. And the answer is, of course, they aren't. And the second is, what's their curriculum? What skills are they actually teaching? And again, I haven't studied all 240 of those offerings, but I looked at a large sample, and it was all about the what, not about the how. And that's a big, big deal. So when I started developing my de-escalation skills, it started when I discovered it in 2005, and then 5 years later, we started in the prison project, and I started seeing these amazing transformations, especially incarcerated people serving life sentences in prison. I started seeing them completely change and transform in front of me. And I began to slowly realize that by teaching them how to listen to and reflect back the emotions of other people, they were becoming emotionally competent. They were becoming in touch with their own emotions in a way that had never happened before. And they were completely changing as human beings, from being gangbangers, murderers, to being real human beings who were interested in serving humanity, even though they were living, we call it moving from a life sentence to a life of service. And I just saw transformation after transformation that dawned on me that what we were really doing is teaching people how to be emotionally competent. And as they became emotionally competent, they became emotionally intelligent.
Wow, boy, what a great explanation, and completely makes sense to me. I'm not, I talk about emotional intelligence in some of my soft skills work, because obviously emotion is a huge, preceding, effect, I guess you could say, on how people interact with each other. But what you just said was very important there. And I think, I understand what you just said about sort of, I don't remember the term that you use, but what we call emotion labeling, right? So if
Affect labeling is
affect labeling.
Mhm.
So, so if I put it into practice terms, if we were having a conversation and you were expressing a tremendous amount of frustration, one thing that I could do to help the situation would be to say, wow, Doug, you sound really frustrated. Is that where you're kind of going with some of this?
Correct. What the science shows, and this is all based on neuroscience, which is
Love
really
it.
kind of amazing.
Yes, I
In
love neuroscience.
2007,
Yeah.
neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman did a brain scanning study and showed why this works the way that it does. But basically, what we do is when we're doing this emotional reflection, or it's called affect labeling, is
Affect labeling. Okay.
affect, AFFECT.
Yeah.
What you do is you ignore the words, you read the emotions or read the emotional data fields, and then you reflect back the emotions with a you statement. So, and the effect of this is to activate the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which in emotional people is completely shut down.
Hmm.
That's the executive function of our brain. And at the same time, it inhibits the amygdala, the amygdala, there are two of them, and other limbic structures associated with strong emotions. That's completely inhibited. And it happens, it's like this. The emotions are up here, you affect label, prefrontal cortex comes online, emotional centers get diminished. And Lieberman showed through fMRI studies how this actually occurs, the pathways in which this occurs in the brain. And that's why I say you can calm any angry person in 90 seconds or less. And what you just said would correct. So if you were upset, I would say, hey, Kev, man, you are really pissed off. You're frustrated. You're angry. Nobody's listening to you. You feel completely disrespected, completely unappreciated. And you're a little worried and anxious. You feel really betrayed. And the whole thing really makes you sad because you feel completely all alone in this situation and there's nobody there for you.
That's fascinating. And what I like to add into that is that, if you go down that road, people will also correct you, and you will
That's
get the
right.
correct emotion. So if I say, Doug, you look really frustrated, you say, no,
No, I'm
man,
not
I'm freaking
frustrated.
pissed off, or I'm
Exactly.
hurt or whatever. Yeah.
Right. And then so there's a reason why this works so well that it does. I don't know how deep we want to get into this, but basically, we, if we're well developed as children, and most of us are not, our parents help us develop an emotional database, words that are associated with various affective states, and that's what these words associated with affective state is what we call emotion. We are not born with emotion. We create emotion. And they're cognitive constructs that we begin to create at around 18 months of age.
Mm.
If we're living in a family where we can do this. Most of us do not live in that kind of a family. We live in emotional dysfunction. And so that's why we have all these problems that we all suffer from: being emotionally unsafe, being shut down, not being vulnerable, not being authentic, because we were never properly coached as children. So when we get upset or angry or emotionally agitated, the prefrontal cortex shuts down. It loses connection to the emotional database. And so what happens is now all we can rely on is the reactivity that we learned, the reactive programming we learned as children.
Yes.
So you see a 40-year-old acting like a 6-year-old. Well, that's exactly right. That 40-year-old is relying on old childhood programming, programmed into him or her by parents, and is absolutely incapable of calming themselves down. Absolutely physically, physiologically incapable.
I get
So
that.
what affect labeling does is we're literally lending our prefrontal cortex to this agitated, upset, angry person for the 90 seconds or so that it takes for them to reconnect to their database and understand what they're experiencing, and now are able to make choices about it. But they're not capable of doing that when they're really upset, because their prefrontal cortex is disconnected. At least the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is disconnected. They can't access the database, so now they're just a victim of whatever their programming was in childhood, and that's what's going to come out.
That's fascinating. And so if we put it down to you've done this amazing job of explaining it, but if we break this down into really simple layman's terms, part of what you're saying is that, as the emotion goes up, the thinking goes down.
That's right, and
And
we
so
see it every day.
every day. And so one of the concepts that we're talking about here is trying to get the emotion down so that you can think better.
That's right.
So that you like you're saying, I haven't heard this. It's fascinating that you can access your rational skills, your rational thinking, I guess you could say.
Right, and it all happens unconsciously.
Yeah.
The upset person doesn't even know what you're doing.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, one moment they're upset, and the next moment they're calm.
Yes,
And
and hence why people go off on somebody, and then an hour later, after they calm down, they say, "God, what? I can't believe I did that," because
But
now
even
they're
if
thinking again.
Well, that's right. But even if they went off on somebody,
Mm.
they're cognitively impaired for 6 to 8 hours. It takes that long for them to get over it. And this is why, for example, in mediations, especially of litigated disputes, I watch lawyers come in, counsel come in, and they get all upset and angry over what's going on because they feel insulted or disrespected. And that happens every day.
Yeah.
I say to myself, dude, you just blew it. Your brain is offline for the next 8 hours. We're going to be really lucky if we can get something going
Yeah.
here.
Gosh, man, most of my mediation involves actually, workplace mediation and, a lot of EEO type stuff.
Yeah, you got all this emotion going on.
I'm recognizing everything that you're saying there about but one more thing, can you teach yourself though to, I guess, say affect labeling? Can
Yes,
you?
absolutely.
Yeah. So how would you do that then if
Well,
you were trying to reprogram your mind
okay. So it really depends on your learning
or
style.
your
Some
emotions? Yeah.
people are DIY, right? They can figure out stuff on their own. So
Yeah.
you get a copy of my book, De-escalate, or you buy my. I put up a webpage for the listeners today, dougnoll.co/ grow yourself.
Grow yourself. Yes.
Grow dash yourself. And on that page, you can get a free ebook that describes all this stuff. You can get a copy of De-escalate the book, but you can also get a copy of my video course, De-escalate.
Wow.
And that will teach you how to do it. I always tell people, when you do the De-escalate course, do it with a trusted friend. And because you've got to practice the skills. And then the other thing you can do, if you want to develop the emotional competency skills we've been talking about, I've got a very advanced course on emotional competency that you can, again, on that page that I created, there are links to all of that. So you can learn. There are 3 ways you can learn. You can learn by reading the book and practicing. You can learn by taking one of the video courses, which will teach you how to do it, as long as you do it with a trusted friend, so you can practice it. And you've got to do it exactly the way that I said. I teach you, because it is a little scary in the beginning. And then the 3rd way, of course, is to hire me to teach you how to do it, because I've taught tens of thousands.
All of what you just said, first of all, so everybody knows, is going to go into the show notes.
Right.
I'm going to ask you about it right at the end of this as well, because I can assure you, I'm going to go out and do all of that, that you just mentioned. And so, I've kind of lost track of even what time we started here, but I do want to ask you more about the prison project. It's fascinating what you're doing, and please tell us about it. And maybe I'll still have a couple of questions relative to that as well.
Okay. So in 2009, a very close colleague and friend of mine, Laurel Coffer, who was a well-known mediator in Southern California, called me from her mailbox, and I live 4 hours north of LA, and she called me and said, "I want to read a letter to you." And she read a letter written by a woman who was and is serving a life sentence without possibility of parole in the largest, most violent women's prison in the world, which is Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla, California. And she was basically asking Laurel if Laurel would be willing to come into the prison and teach the life inmates how to be peacemakers and mediators, because they were tired of the prison violence. Their community, they're going to be there all their lives. The guards weren't, instigated violence. They didn't stop the violence. And what could they do? So Laurel read the letter to me and said, "What do you think?" And I thought about it for about a nanosecond. If this is real, I think we should do this. This is an incredible opportunity. So it took us 6 months to get permission to start, and we had to write a curriculum, and we wrote a curriculum. We're both trainers and professors, but we knew that working with incarcerated people, we had to do this differently than we would do it for graduate students, for example, because they have no skills.
Yeah.
So,
and we can assume that there's quite a bit of emotional problems and damage.
That's right. And we knew we were going to have, So anyways, we started with our first 15 women in April of 2010. These women range in age from 30 years all the way up to 65, every ethnicity you can imagine, education from no high school all the way up to graduate degrees, and all lifers, all murderers, or at least homicides. And it was all a big experiment. And it was the most amazing experience teaching experience either one of us had ever had. I could tell you story after story after story. But after we started, by the time we got through week 6 of what was then a 12-week program, we had 250 women on a waiting list wanting to be trained. And so we started doing massive trainings after that, after we demonstrated this really worked. And in 3 years, that would have been 2012, end of 2012, we had, I guess it'd been 2 years. Yeah, 2 years. We had trained trainers. We had women, incarcerated women, serving life and long-term sentences, about 15 or 20 of them that we had trained as trainers. And now they were taking over the program and doing the training. And we got a letter from the warden saying he couldn't believe the difference that our training had made in the prison. He could no longer say this is a violent place. It's really calmed down a lot. Not that they don't have their problems, but completely calmed down. Wow. So then after that, in 2012, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation decided to repurpose the prison to a men's prison. So they shipped the women out, and we said, we'll follow you wherever you go. They're either going across the street to the other women's institution or down to Southern California. And we said we'd follow you. And then we got called from the warden saying, the men are coming here. We need programming. Will you guys bring prison of peace into the men? We said, no. This is all pro bono. We were getting paid a dime for this. And finally, we said yes. So in October of 2013, we started with our first men cohort at what was then and today is Valley State Prison. Exactly the same results as we got with the women. And 3 years later, we had successfully built a sustainable program at VSP, and we were about to quit because we were bankrupting ourselves. We'd given up our professional practices to do this work and had no money. And all of a sudden, the state started giving us grants. And so before the pandemic, we were in 15 California prisons. We had trained a colleague of ours who's a Greek lawyer living in Athens, and she's got prison of peace going in 12 or 14 prisons in Greece. We've got 4 psychologists starting prison of peace in Italy. I've got a colleague in Nairobi, mediator in Nairobi, who's got 30 mediators ready to do prison of peace in Kenya. And so it's spreading. And we got a prison. We got a grant in Connecticut to do prison of peace in a Connecticut men's prison. The pandemic hit, and of course, no programming. Yeah. So, but what we did do is we took some of our grant funds with the permission of the department, and we spent last year filming our entire curriculum. Wow. And now we're in post-production, and in a couple of months, we will be able to offer prison of peace to any prison in the world, because we'll subtitle everything. And all we need are people who are interested in being facilitators. You don't have to know the curriculum. We do have to train you how to facilitate it, but
Sure.
it's 10 or 15 hours of training, and then if people are able to, they can go ahead and start teaching prison of peace wherever they live in any institution, and not only in inside prisons or jails, but also in reentry facilities and even domestic relation shelters. Some of the statistics, we've trained over 20,000 inmates at one level or another in prison of peace. In California, we've had about 3,000 of our students released, not one reported recidivism. None of our students have ever reoffended.
That's incredible. I mean, because we know recidivism is
Right.
a
It's horrible.
massive problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
we know the project works,
Yeah.
and that the skills work. And of course, the testimonials we get from the
I'm
from the
just,
um,
you know,
people, our students, are crazy. And really what caused me to write De-escalate, my fourth book, I wasn't planning on really writing another book, but the inmates, our incarcerated students, said, would you please, they knew I was an author, would you please write up a book about what you're teaching us so that we can have something to show our families, because they're all seeing changes in us and they want our skills, and will you please write the book? So that's what I ended up doing. And the book was kind of a whole
wow.
story.
I mean, just really, it's amazing. And I'm hearing actually our entire conversation sort of come into a certain, um, lane, I guess you could say, starting with this is what happens when you take a driven person and get them to become passionate
That's right.
and have a purpose, and like yours is to serve humanity. And and just wow. I mean, I just want to congratulate you. I do want to ask you about this because I'm fascinated by this. It's on the same topic, but a slight diversion here. What do you mean by listening others into existence? What does that mean?
So it's just a phrase that I'll just tell you how I came up with the phrase. So I do teach. I've taught these skills in education. In the Fresno Unified School District, when they were adopting their restorative practices, disciplinary philosophy, I was called in to teach these kinds of skills at a high school and the middle school clusters. And I was in a middle school one day, and I was teaching a small group of middle school teachers how to conduct what we call listening peace circles. And in the listening peace circle, we present a question that everybody has, and they can talk about it. So we would say something, for example, like, what is peace? And then the second question is, how does peace manifest in your life? And then what can you do in the next week to
Mhm.
create more peace in your life? So they're value questions.
Yes.
But before you can earn the turn to speak, before you get the talking piece, you have to affect label and reflect back what this person to your right said,
Wow.
both in terms of their words and their feelings. So we completed the circle, all three questions. I don't remember what the topic was. And one of the people in the circle was an administrator, a superintendent, who was kind of watching. She'd heard all this stuff about this guy, Doug Noll, and was just kind of curious about what this was. And she said, that's the first time I felt listened to before in my life.
That's just
And she said,
extraordinary.
and she's in her late 30s, early 40s, and said, my whole life I've always been ignored, even at work. I'm completely ignored and disrespected, and nobody pays attention to me. And when I speak, nobody pays attention to me. This is the first time I've ever felt listened to. I felt like you just listened me into existence. And
You know,
that's when I realized, okay, that's what this is all about.
this is incredible. And again, I'm just kind of being transparent with my thoughts. You made me start when you mentioned about the peace circle. Made me think about several years ago. I took my daughters down to Nicaragua on a mission trip from our church, and this, that, and the other. And we sat in this circle with many of the locals. And so there was, there was young kids that came down. There was adults, that came from our church, and then there was many locals, both adults and younger people. And I remember, and we all sat in a circle, and I was probably 30, 40 people sitting in this circle. I guess maybe 30 people sitting in a circle. And our pastor, who was kind of facilitating the conversation, he asked a question that and I've used since then. Thank you, John Hinkle, for this great idea. And the question was this, and I'm thinking about what you're talking about there, using this peace circle and how you have to affect label. And he asked a question kind of out of nowhere: what burdens you?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Wow. And, you know, I even when he said it, I remember just sort of sinking into this really state of thinking, you know, and you could see everybody else. It was just like an immediate drop in a night in a good way of tone.
Right.
And then people started talking. And I remember got one to one of my daughters, and she was just pouring tears out, expressing what burdened her. I'm getting choked up just thinking about it. But this idea that, you know, that you're saying, you know, what a beautiful thing for maybe people to practice in their organization and their
Yeah, we could talk
workplace.
exactly. We could talk all day about some of the processes we use in prison of peace and how they could be adapted in other, how they are adapted in other environments. Um, I know we could keep talking
Yeah.
all day long. I've got another Zoom call in
Okay.
with a peacemaker in India that I've got to take in
Oh,
about
very nice. Very nice.
and I don't really even know what that's all about. So but it's midnight there.
Wow.
So
Listen,
I
I've only got 1,000 more questions. I mean, you can't give me just a few more hours. So listen, no, what ended up here, you know, I would love to do a part B if we could at some given
absolutely,
point and talk about. There's so
absolutely.
much
Just
to
let's
talk about.
schedule it and
So
make it happen.
we'll just call it a hard stop here, and just let me thank you from the bottom of my heart, Doug, for really
Oh,
just
Kevin, it's been fun. A great conversation.
transparency and beautiful things. So listen, you'll be back, and so I'll look
Okay.
forward to that.
Yeah,
Okay,
just let me know when you want me back, and we'll do another
you
recording.
got it. God bless you. Talk to you
Okay.
soon. All right.
Talk.
Bye bye.